Jimmy Hoffa, The Mob, The Union and the Vanishing Kingpin. Mob Truth. You are watching Mob Truth. Subscribe now and join the family, soldier. And don't forget to check out the official Mob Truth merch, linked below. Detroit, the Motor City, where industry boomed and unions became the heartbeat of the working man. But behind the picket signs and promises of fair wages, power and corruption walked hand in hand. At the center of it all stood one man, Jimmy Hoffa. To some, he was a hero of the workers. To others, he was a ruthless power broker with dangerous ties. His rise was legendary, and his disappearance remains one of America's greatest mysteries. Detroit in the 1930s and 40s, a city alive with industry, but boiling with tension. Workers demanded dignity, fair wages, and the right to be heard. Out on the streets, fists were raised high, voices united in defiance, and one name began to rise above the noise: Jimmy Hoffa. Why'd Teamsters march? Hoffa became the voice of the working man. Through the Teamsters union, he promised strength in numbers, an army of laborers standing shoulder to shoulder. But behind the chants and signs of solidarity lay a growing web of influence, one that would connect the shop floor to the smoky backrooms of organized crime. By the 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just another labor leader. He was the voice of America's working class. From the podium, his speeches carried the rhythm of a fighter and the confidence of a man who knew the crowd belonged to him. To the rank-and-file Teamsters, Hoffa was a savior. He talked about fair wages, strong pensions, and security for the families of truck drivers who spent long nights on the road. When Hoffa spoke, men believed him, because he came from their world. He wore their struggles like armor. But Hoffa's rise wasn't built on promises alone. Behind the thunder of applause was a machine powered by money and influence. Union dues poured in by the millions, funding not just contracts and strikes, but political favors and backroom negotiations. Briefcases stuffed with cash moved quietly from office to office, ensuring loyalty, fear, and control. For Hoffa, this was strategy, not corruption. He believed that power was the only language America's elite understood. And if the mob could provide muscle, Hoffa wasn't afraid to shake their hand. To him, the union's survival came first, no matter the cost. By the 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just another labor leader. He was becoming a symbol of working-class power. When Hoffa stood at the podium, sleeves rolled up, his voice carried through smoke-filled halls and crowded parking lots. To the rank-and-file truckers, he wasn't a distant politician. He was one of them, a fighter who promised to deliver real wages and dignity on the job. But behind the applause, Hoffa was building something far bigger. The Teamsters were no longer a scrappy union. They were a machine powered by money, contracts, and raw influence. Union dues poured in by the millions, giving Hoffa a war chest that made politicians pay attention. That money funded campaigns, secured contracts, and bought favors that stretched from Detroit to Washington. Hoffa understood leverage better than anyone. Strikes weren't just about workers walking out. They were pressure points, reminders that the nation's supply chain could be frozen in an instant. Every handshake deal, every contract signed, came with unspoken power. And if anyone doubted his reach, the briefcases, stuffed with cash, moving quietly from office to office, told the real story. To his men, Hoffa was armor, someone who wore their struggles on his back. To his enemies, he was dangerous. And to the mob, he was invaluable. The Teamsters provided the perfect bridge: millions in pension funds, thousands of loyal members, and a leader willing to deal with the underworld if it meant keeping control. For Jimmy Hoffa, the union wasn't just about labor. It was about power, and he intended to wield it. In smoke-filled backrooms, power wasn't written on paper. It was carved into whispered deals across tables like this one. Hoffa knew that the Teamsters weren't just truck drivers. They were an army, and armies needed protection. That protection came from the men in the shadows, men who spoke the language of power with a glance, a handshake, or the flick of a cigar. The Mafia sat across from him, and they weren't asking politely. They offered what the law could never give: muscle, money, and silence. With the mob behind him, Hoffa could deliver contracts, strikes, and victories that made workers worship him. Without them, he was just another union man shouting into the wind. Every favor asked came with a price. Every envelope of cash slid across the table meant another tie binding him deeper into the underworld. And Hoffa embraced it. For him, deals struck in these smoky rooms weren't betrayals of the working man. They were the only way to guarantee victory. By the mid-20th century, the line between labor and organized crime had blurred into one. To outsiders, Hoffa was the voice of the working class. But here, in rooms like this, he was something else. A partner, a power broker, a man the mob could trust. And that partnership would carry him to heights no labor leader in America had ever reached, and eventually to the danger that would consume him. Investigators would later say that what started as protection soon became partnership. The Teamsters' vast pension fund, a mountain of cash meant for working men's retirements, turned into leverage. Loans were approved for construction projects, trucking outfits, and glitzy developments far from Detroit. According to federal files and courtroom testimony, some of those loans flowed into hands tied to organized crime. The union got influence, the underworld got capital, and Jimmy Hoffa stood at the center of the exchange. There were gatekeepers around that money. Trusted lieutenants handled the paperwork and the introductions, men who could translate between union offices and underworld social clubs. If a project needed a loan, there were quiet meetings like this: a table, a few cigars, a calendar, and a number that would decide the fate of a hotel, a casino, or a construction site. Nothing on paper looked criminal. On paper, everything looked like business. But power like this creates enemies. Inside the Teamsters, rivals watched Hoffa's rise with clenched teeth. Outside, lawmen sharpened their knives. Reporters whispered that the union's war chest had become a faucet for mob-connected ventures. Competitors in other unions claimed Hoffa was playing a different game, one they couldn't beat without stepping into the same shadows. Hoffa's answer was always the same: results. Contracts got better, wages rose, benefits solidified. When trucks needed to roll, they rolled. When they needed to stop, they stopped. And entire industries felt the pressure. To the rank and file, that was proof he was doing exactly what he promised. To prosecutors, it was proof he held a kind of power the country wasn't comfortable with. Then came the political spotlight. Senate hearings, cameras, young prosecutors who wanted a trophy, and one name glittered more than any other. Questions turned into subpoenas. Subpoenas turned into indictments. The message from Washington was clear. The old way of doing business, the handshakes in smoky rooms, the pension loans that never quite looked wrong but never quite felt right, was over. Hoffa didn't blink. He called the charges grandstanding. He said the government didn't understand labor, didn't understand leverage, didn't understand what it took to negotiate with giants. He reminded anyone who would listen that every deal, every decision, was made to protect the working man. And he said the accusations about the mob were myths spun by enemies who couldn't beat him at the bargaining table. But in rooms like this, even allies began to worry. The more heat Hoffa drew, the more uncomfortable the men across the table became. Pressure brings cracks. Old friendships sour when indictments land. Promises get complicated when cameras are outside the door. And the same alliances that had lifted Hoffa up began to tug at him from every direction. Some urging him to keep fighting, others suggesting he step back before the fire consumed everyone. Still, Hoffa kept his posture at the table, shoulders square, voice low, eyes steady. He believed the movement he built was bigger than the accusations, bigger than the hearings, bigger than the men in this room. But as the smoke curled toward the ceiling, even he could sense the shift. The game he mastered was changing, and the walls were inching closer. That's the paradox of power. It opens doors that stay locked for ordinary men, and it also paints a target on your back. In these late-night meetings between the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs, the future of Jimmy Hoffa was being written line by line. Not by signatures on paper, by the weight of favors owed, secrets kept, and the growing cost of every handshake. The players enter. Power never moves alone. Around Jimmy Hoffa stood men with their own ambitions, loyalties, and grudges. The kind of company that can make a king or bury one. On the Union side sat Frank Fitzsimmons, the quiet lieutenant who thrived while Hoffa fought his battles. When Hoffa went to prison, Fitzsimmons slipped into the big chair and discovered he liked the view. He was friendly with politicians, easy with the press, and far less interested in kicking down doors. To Hoffa, that made him soft, and it made him a problem. Then there was Alan Dorfman, the money man, a conduit to the Teamsters' massive pension fund. Deals needed financing, Las Vegas loved financing, and the pension loved interest. Dorfman spoke the language of ledgers and return rates, but the people shaking his hand were sometimes the very men lawmen were chasing. Where money gathers, shadows gather too. From Detroit came the men who ran the street calendar, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and his brother Vito, Billy Jack Giacalone. They were the hosts you didn't keep waiting, the kind of men who could arrange a meeting and make sure everyone understood the stakes before they sat down. If there was order in the underworld, the Giacalones enforced it. From New Jersey came the storm. Anthony Tony Provenzano, a tough, ambitious Teamsters boss with Genovese family connections and a temper that boiled quick. Hoffa and Tony Pro once needed each other. Later, they could barely stand to be in the same room. Their feud was born in union politics and hardened in prison corridors. Insults traded, debts tallied, scores remembered. Around Tony Pro moved serious people. Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, the swift, sharp enforcer. Gabriel Briguglio, never far behind. Smiles at the table, ice in the eyes. Orbiting Hoffa was a mix of loyalty and legend. Charles Chucky O'Brien, the longtime Hoffa family friend, moved in and out of his world. Sometimes driver, sometimes messenger, always close enough to be noticed. Frank Sheeran, the quiet teamster out of Pennsylvania with a soldier's manner, would one day claim a role in the final act. A claim argued over to this day. And far up the chain, the old world steady hand, Russell Bufalino, the understated boss who preferred calm voices and long memories. If he spoke, men listened. If he stayed silent, they listened harder. Across from all of them stood the government, gathering files and sharpening questions. In Washington, a young senator named Robert F. Kennedy had already clashed with Hoffa at televised hearings. A duel of grins and barbs that turned into a vendetta when Kennedy became Attorney General. To Hoffa, RFK was a grandstander who didn't understand labor. To RFK, Hoffa was the symbol of the rot he was determined to cut out. This was the board. Union chiefs, money men, street bosses, government crusaders, each pulling a thread tied to Hoffa's name. And Jimmy, for all his strength, was standing in the middle, daring anyone to move him. When Hoffa looked around these rooms, he didn't see villains and saints. He saw leverage. Men who could deliver votes, trucks, silence, financing, and fear. But leverage is rented, never owned. Friendships thin when indictments land. Memories sharpen when power shifts. And behind the applause, behind the headlines, behind the cool voice at the microphone, a whisper kept returning. Too many debts, too many rivalries, too many men who benefit if Jimmy Hoffa steps aside. He wasn't the kind of man who steps aside. So the meetings continued. Calls were placed, promises made and unmade. Some urged Jimmy to bide his time, accept the restrictions, let the years pass, return quietly when the heat cooled. Others told him to take back what was his, push Fitzsimmons out, remind the country that the Teamsters answered to Hoffa, not to Washington, not to the mob, not to anyone. That decision would light the fuse, because once Hoffa announced he was coming back, every man with an interest, from Union headquarters to Detroit backrooms to New Jersey social clubs, suddenly had something to lose. And when powerful men start worrying about what they could lose, they start planning for what they're willing to do. These were the faces in the crowd behind the headlines. And as the smoke thinned and the ashtrays filled, the road ahead narrowed to a single question. Would Jimmy Hoffa bend, or would someone make sure he disappeared from the board altogether? Jimmy Hoffa didn't come here to reminisce. He came to test loyalties and set the terms of his return. Fitzsimmons was warming his chair. The pension money had new gatekeepers, and word on the street was that some people preferred Hoffa gone for good, politically or otherwise. So he sat under the bulb, stone-faced, and sent a message. The Teamsters were built on his fights, his strikes, his deals. He wanted the backing to take his seat again, and the men who controlled meetings, money, and muscle were about to show whether they were with him or in his way. Prison years. Power met a concrete wall. Federal prosecutors finally got what they wanted. Jimmy Hoffa in a federal cell. The charges carried headlines: jury tampering, corruption, pension abuses, the exact mix that made the public nod and the press lean in. To his enemies, it was justice. To Hoffa, it was politics dressed as law. Prison didn't soften him. It focused him. The routine was iron: counts, gates, the scrape of boots down a corridor. But inside that schedule, Hoffa built another kind of order. He read files, replayed deals in his head, kept a running ledger of loyalties. He lifted weights, kept his posture, made sure every guard and every inmate knew he wasn't broken. If they took his freedom, they didn't take his will. And prison brought old tensions into close quarters. There were other union men doing time, men with their own fiefdoms and their own tempers. One name kept circling his orbit: Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. Once an ally, now a rival with a long memory. In the cafeteria, in the yard, in the murmurs that passed between steel doors, the two men's feud hardened. Debts were mentioned, respect was demanded, slights were not forgotten. It wasn't just personal. It was about who would control the union landscape when the gates finally opened. Outside, the world didn't freeze. Frank Fitzsimmons wore the suit, shook hands in Washington, and found the union a little easier to run when the sharp edges were filed down. Contracts still came. Photographs looked pleasant. Some said the pressure eased because the government preferred it that way. Others said certain underworld interests liked the new tone. Quieter, more predictable, less likely to set the city on fire for a better deal. Every month Hoffa sat inside. The ground outside shifted a little more under his name. Then came the move from the top, a commutation. Freedom, but with strings attached. The kind that tug at a proud man's throat. The message was simple: enjoy your life, but stay out of Teamsters politics for years. For most people, that would be the end of the story. For Hoffa, it was the start of the next fight. He didn't accept retirement, he didn't accept silence, and he absolutely did not accept that the union he built would live under someone else's fingerprints. From the day he walked out, he worked the phones. Old lieutenants were sounded out. Local leaders were counted and recounted. The money men, the ones who handled loans, projects, and introductions, were quietly asked where their loyalties lived now. Some spoke softly and stalled. Some nodded in private and avoided cameras. Others told him the truth he already knew. Trying to come back would ignite a war. And still he pushed. Hoffa insisted the restrictions on his return were unlawful, that no paper from any office could erase the will of the members. He planned meetings, pressed his allies, and sent word through intermediaries that he wanted sit-downs, the kind that could clear the calendar or blow it to pieces. The names looped back like clockwork: the Giacalones in Detroit, Tony Pro's circle out east, the men around the pension fund, and the quiet figures who preferred their names never appeared in print. Inside that cell, he'd promised himself one thing: he would not be remembered as a man who let others finish his story. He intended to write the last chapter himself, even if every line pulled him closer to the people who had the most to lose if he won. By the time summer rolled around, there was a date, a place, and a purpose. What started as a legal fight had become a test of nerve. If Hoffa could walk into a room, look old rivals in the eye, and walk out with a green light, the road back to the throne would open. If not, the men who thrived without him would make sure he stayed out, one way or another. The last day, July sun, late afternoon. The sign reads Red Fox, a quiet steakhouse in the suburbs, the kind of place where deals feel harmless. Hoffa pulls in for a meeting he's been pushing toward for weeks. The plan, as he understood it: sit with the men who can clear his path back, the Detroit intermediaries, and the rival whose name shadowed every conversation: Tony Pro. He hates being kept waiting. He checks his watch. He paces. He makes calls to family, to a friend, saying he's being stood up, saying he'll head home soon. But this is Hoffa. Even while annoyed, he's reading the lot like a chessboard. Who's here, who isn't, which cars circle twice. He's a man used to controlling the agenda. Today, the agenda controls him. The meeting window narrows. If the sit-down happens, it can end the feud or end the comeback. If it doesn't, he'll call another, push harder, lean on allies until the door opens. That was the rhythm of his life. Pressure applied until metal bent. Witnesses see him near the entrance, see him scanning faces. Some will later swear he was approached. Others remember a brief exchange, a nod toward a car, the sort of casual gesture men use when they've met before. The government will collect statements, build timelines, draw maps with arrows from the doorway to the edge of the lot. None of it will explain what happened in the space of a few minutes. Names float around the scene like cigarette smoke. Tony Jack and Billy Giacalone, who arrange meetings when the calendar must be obeyed. The ever-present orbit of Tony Pro. Men close to Hoffa like Chucky O'Brien, pulled into the narrative by proximity and memory and decades of speculation. Everyone will have a version. Few will match. What we know is simple. Hoffa came for a decision. Either he would walk out with a green light, an understanding that his return would be tolerated, or he would be told to stand down. Pride and power don't mix well with ultimatums, and Hoffa didn't do ultimatums. Some say a car door opened and closed. Some say the meeting shifted to another location, away from the restaurant, away from watchful eyes. The truth is swallowed by the ordinary quiet of a summer parking lot. Evening edges in. Inside, diners set down steak knives. Outside, the asphalt holds heat and secrets. By the time the sun drops, Jimmy Hoffa is gone. No struggle, no scene, no witness who can tell the whole story from start to finish. Just a man who walked toward a conversation and never walked back. Phone lines catch fire. Friends call friends. The FBI begins the clock. And the list of people with motive, political, personal, financial, is longer than the parking spaces outside the Red Fox. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was the sudden removal of a force that had pushed against America for decades. And with Hoffa off the board, everyone he threatened breathes easier. Where is Hoffa? Where is Hoffa? The headline never changes. The FBI dug fields, ripped up lots, followed 1,000 tips. Names still orbit the case. Tony Pro, the Giacalones, Dorfman, O'Brien. But the gravity is one man, Jimmy Hoffa. To night shift drivers, he was a champion. To his enemies, an empire in one suit. Decades later, the files are thick, the answers thin, and the question hits just as hard. That was Jimmy Hoffa's story, written in power, erased. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? Maybe the alley knows, but it's not talking. This is Mob Truth. Subscribe, drop your theory below, and welcome to all the new soldiers. Grab the merch, link in the description. See you in the next one.